York, this is Democracy Now!
It had nothing to do about enforcing voting rights. It was all about trying to target immigrants and preserve white political power for the next decade.
Newly surfaced documents show how a now-dead senior Republican strategist who specialized in gerrymandering was secretly behind the Trump administration's efforts to add a citizenship question to the 2020 census. We'll get an update from Mother Jones reporter Ari Berman. Then Clarence Thomas knows nothing of my work. Author Adam Cohen says the Supreme Court justice used his book to tie abortion to eugenics, but got it wrong.
In fact, during the eugenics movement of the 20th century, the focus was on something different, on eugenic sterilization. Abortion wasn't a factor. It wasn't what the leaders were talking about or favored. But it's convenient right now for enemies of abortion to say that it was about abortion because they'd like to tar abortion with that eugenics brush today.
Then President Trump is considering presidential pardons for American military members convicted of war crimes.
We're looking at a lot of different pardons for a lot of different people. Some of these soldiers are people that have fought hard, long. You know, we teach them how to be great fighters, and then when they fight, sometimes they get really treated very unfairly.
We'll get response from a combat veteran of Iraq, Waitman Wade Bourne, whose new piece for the Washington Post is headlined, "I led a platoon in Iraq. Trump is wrong to pardon war criminals." All that and more coming up. Welcome to Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, The War and Peace Report. I'm Amy Goodman. New details emerged over the weekend in the mass shooting in Virginia Beach in which a gunman opened fire on a municipal building, killing 12 people. 4 people remained in critical condition Sunday. The gunman, 40-year-old Dwayne Craddock, who also died from gunshot wounds, had worked at the site of the massacre for 15 years as an engineer. He emailed his resignation earlier that day, although authorities say he was in good standing at work. From 1996 to 2002, he was a member of the Virginia National Guard. Authorities say the gunman used 2 legally bought .45 caliber pistols and that they found 2 more firearms at his home. No motive has been found for the mass shooting. On CBS's Face the Nation Sunday, Democratic Virginia Senator Mark Warner called for congressional action on gun control.
This just doesn't happen in other civilized nations at this level of violence. I have felt that we ought to take steps against assault weapons. The suppressors, I'd like to hear what the legitimate reason is in terms of either self-defense or hunting.
Friday's rampage was the deadliest mass shooting in the U.S. so far this year. Homeland Security's internal watchdog warned of dangerous overcrowding at migrant prisons on the U.S. southern border. In a report released Thursday, inspectors said they saw 900 people jammed into facilities in El Paso, Texas, intended for a maximum capacity of 125 people. Some of the imprisoned migrants were forced to stand for days due to lack of space, while some had to stand on toilets to get breathing space. The report advised Customs and Border Protection to take immediate steps to remedy the situation. President Trump has sought to place blame for the increase in migrants on the Mexican government. On Thursday, he threatened to impose a 5% tariff on Mexican goods starting next week until Mexico cracks down on Central American migrants heading for the U.S. border. The tariff would increase 5% every month until it hits 25%. Mexican officials are set to hold talks with the Trump administration this week. In more news from the border, Johanna Medina, a transgender asylum seeker from El Salvador, died while in ICE custody on Saturday, according to several LGBT groups and advocates who knew her. Medina had sought medical treatment for over 2 months for complications related to HIV/AIDS before finally being transferred to an El Paso hospital, but did not survive. Johanna Medina is believed to be the second transgender migrant to die in Immigrations and Customs Enforcement custody since Trump became president. In Missouri, a judge granted a temporary restraining order to Planned Parenthood, allowing the state's only abortion clinic to remain open after health department officials refused to renew its license. The fate of the clinic is still uncertain, however, and another hearing is scheduled for Tuesday. In the Sudanese capital, Khartoum, at least 9 people have been reported killed after military forces raided an ongoing sit-in in front of the Defense Ministry Monday morning. Soldiers reportedly launched tear gas, followed by sound grenades to disperse protesters before opening live fire. Demonstrators from a range of civil society groups are demanding a civilian transitional government following the overthrow of President Omar al-Bashir in April after a months-long popular uprising and the military's subsequent government takeover. Protesters moved to other parts of the city to continue their demonstration. Last week, Sudanese authorities shut down Al Jazeera's Khartoum bureau and banned the outlet's reporters. In Honduras, protesters set fire to the front of the U.S. Embassy in the capital, Tegucigalpa, Friday. No injuries were reported. The fire came amidst massive protests against plans by President Juan Orlando Hernandez to privatize health care, pensions, and education. This is protester and activist Wilfredo Mendez.
Hopefully the U.S. congressmen and senators who are Democrats can present this message with force to the Trump administration, who is supporting this dictator, Juan Orlando Hernandez. This is a clear expression of repudiation to a U.S. administration that has supported a dictatorship and turned its back on the Honduran people.
In Jerusalem, hundreds of ultra-nationalist Jewish settlers entered the Al-Aqsa Mosque on Sunday, flanked by heavily armed Israeli forces, provoking protests by Palestinians. Police arrested 7 people using tear gas, rubber bullets, and pepper spray to disperse the protesters. It was the first time in 3 decades that Israel allowed Jews into the site during the final days of the Muslim holy month of Ramadan, and came on Jerusalem Day, an Israeli commemoration of the 1967 occupation of East Jerusalem. President Trump is in the UK for a state visit amidst both public and political opposition. London Mayor Sadiq Khan blasted Trump and Britain's red carpet welcome ahead of Trump's trip, comparing Trump and other far-right heads of state to fascist leaders of the 20th century. In an op-ed for The Guardian, Mayor Khan took aim at Trump's family separation policy, his defense of the 2017 white supremacist rally in Charlottesville, and the Muslim travel ban. Sadiq Khan is the first Muslim mayor of London. In an interview with the Sunday Times ahead of his visit, Trump said Britain should refuse to pay the nearly $50 billion Brexit bill and walk away if they do not get what they want from the EU in the contentious deal. Trump also recently said former Foreign Minister Boris Johnson would make an excellent replacement for Prime Minister Theresa May, who's set to leave office at the end of this week after resigning over her failure to pass a Brexit deal in Parliament. President Trump and First Lady Melania were welcomed at Buckingham Palace by Queen Elizabeth and Prince Charles today. The Duchess of Sussex, Meghan Markle, was not present. Trump called Markle nasty during an interview with The Sun after he learned she came out against his 2016 candidacy, calling him misogynistic and divisive. Trump denied making the comment about Markle, who's African-American, but Trump's own re-election campaign put out a recording and transcript of the interview showing he did call her nasty. In Canada, a national inquiry found the disappearance and murder of thousands of Indigenous women and girls over decades amounts to a Canadian genocide. The report, which is obtained by CBC News ahead of its official release today, says, quote, "We do know that thousands of Indigenous women, girls, and two-spirit, lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender, queer, questioning, intersex, and asexual have been lost to the Canadian genocide to date and are the result of, quote, state actions and inactions rooted in colonialism and colonial ideologies." New State Department rules that went into effect on Friday will require all U.S. visa applicants to submit their social media information for the past 5 years. The information would give authorities access to applicants' photos, locations, among other personal data, often shared on social media platforms. When the Trump administration first proposed the new rules last year, the ACL warned that it will infringe on the rights of immigrants and U.S. citizens by chilling freedom of speech and association, particularly because people will now have to wonder if what they say online will be misconstrued or misunderstood understood by a government official, the ACLU said. The Federal Aviation Administration said Sunday over 300 of Boeing's 737 aircraft could have faulty parts on their wings. The issue would affect both MAX and NG, or next-generation jets, the MAX's predecessor, and is due to a possible manufacturing flaw in their leading-edge slat tracks, which guide the panels used on the wing during takeoffs and landings to provide additional lift. Boeing 737 MAX airplanes have been grounded worldwide following the fatal crash of an Ethiopian Airlines jet in March, less than 5 months after Indonesia's Lion Air crash in October of last year. The two crashes killed everyone on board, a total of 346 people. And California Congressmember Duncan Hunter is coming under fire after saying he and his unit probably killed hundreds of civilians while serving in Iraq in 2004. Hunter made the comments during an episode of the Barstool Sports podcast Zero Blog 30 while defending Navy SEAL officer Edward Gallagher, who was released from custody Thursday as he awaits his trial for alleged war crimes. Edward Gallagher is facing charges of shooting unarmed civilians and killing a wounded captive teenager by stabbing him with a knife, then staging a re-enlistment ceremony over the teenager's dead body, which he then photographed and reportedly texted to a fellow Navy SEAL. During the interview, Hunter also acknowledged taking a photo with a dead combatant and said, quote, "A lot of us have done the exact same thing." This is Congressmember Hunter responding to a question about the killing of the captive teenager.
I frankly don't care if he was killed. I just don't care, and that's my personal point of view. And as a congressman, that's my prerogative to help a guy out like that. Even if everything that the prosecutors say is true in this case, then Eddie Gallagher should still be given a break, I think.
Edward Gallagher is due to stand trial June 10th for his alleged war crimes. Separately, Duncan Hunter is facing charges related to the misuse of campaign funds and is set to face trial later this year. And those are some of the headlines. This is Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, The War and Peace Report. I'm Amy Goodman. Newly surfaced documents have revealed that a now-dead senior Republican strategist who specialized in gerrymandering was secretly behind the Trump administration's efforts to add a citizenship question to the 2020 census. The New York Times broke the story last week in a story that called Thomas Hofeller the Michelangelo of gerrymandering. When Hofeller died last August, he left behind a computer hard drive full of his notes and records. His estranged daughter found among the documents a 2015 study that said adding the citizenship question to the census would, quote, be advantageous to Republicans and non-Hispanic whites and would clearly be a disadvantage to the Democrats, unquote. Census officials estimate 6.5 million people will not respond to the census if the citizenship question is added. This undercount could affect everything from the redrawing of congressional maps to the allocation of federal funding. In a court filing Thursday, plaintiffs challenging the citizenship question accused 2 Trump administration officials of falsely testifying under oath about the Justice Department's motivations for altering the census. The Supreme Court is also set to rule within weeks on whether Commerce Secretary Wilbur Ross had the authority to add the citizenship question to the census. For more, we're joined by Ari Berman, senior writer at Mother Jones, a reporting fellow at the Nation Institute, author of Give Us the Ballot, The Modern Struggle for Voting Rights in America. His new piece is headlined, Architect of GOP Gerrymandering Was Behind Trump's Census Citizenship Question. Ari Berman, welcome back to Democracy Now! It's great to have you with us. So lay out this expose.
Good to see you again, Amy. So this is really startling smoking gun evidence in the census case that really undercuts why the Trump administration added this question. So the Trump administration added the citizenship question, and they claimed it was needed to better enforce the Voting Rights Act. Well, these new documents from Tom Hofeller show that it was not needed to enforce the Voting Rights Act. And in fact, the people that would be most harmed by the addition of the citizenship question, Latinos and other racial minorities, are the very groups the Voting Rights Act Act was designed to protect. And it clearly shows that this question was added to benefit the Republican Party, particularly white Republicans, because Tom Hofeller says in this unpublished study that is now key evidence in this case, this would be clearly a disadvantage to Democrats and an advantage to Republicans. So there you have it. I mean, this is really black and white. You can't get any more explicit than this. We now know for certain this is why the question was added to the census.
And talk about how we know this. Talk about Hofeller's estranged daughter.
Well, it's a pretty wild story. So there's a separate case in North Carolina challenging the gerrymandering of state legislative districts. Tom Hofeller has been the go-to expert in the Republican Party for decades on redistricting. And he's drawn some of the most extreme gerrymandered maps in places like North Carolina. And so there's a case challenging this map in North Carolina, and after Hofeller passed away, his daughter found hard drives with all of his work, and she gave it over to the plaintiffs challenging these gerrymandering.
Gave it to Common Cause.
Gave it to Common Cause and other plaintiffs challenging the gerrymandering in North Carolina. Now some of this evidence has now become public. There is more here, too, by the way, Amy. We're going to learn more about the role that Tom Hofeller has played in gerrymandering efforts in other cases, but this pertains directly to the census case.
So the New York Times calls him the Michelangelo of gerrymandering. Talk about his whole history and also how this could have legal bearing and even going to the issue of the Supreme Court making a decision about Wilbur Ross adding the question, the citizenship question in the census.
So Tom Hofeller is not a household name, but he's been an extremely influential person in the Republican Party for decades. He's basically been the Republican Party's go-to guy when it comes to redistricting. So he's traveled since the 1980s, state after state after state, drawn maps to boost Republican representation. And a lot of these maps, particularly after the 2010 election, have been struck down in court. So really gerrymandered maps he drew in places like North Carolina and Ohio have been invalidated by the courts. In fact, the North Carolina congressional map that Hofeller drew was invalidated by the Supreme Court in an opinion written by Clarence Thomas, who found that it was an unconstitutional racial gerrymandering. So even Clarence Thomas thought that the maps that Hofeller was drawing were too extreme. And the fact that you had the architect of GOP gerrymandering drawing up the census citizenship question is so startling, Amy, because the census forms the basis for redistricting. So we have to have unfair, inaccurate census data to be able to draw fair districts. If we have skewed census data, that's going to lead to skewed districts. So even before they start the gerrymandering itself, they're essentially gerrymandering the census to give themselves an advantage.
So in the 90s, Thomas Hofeller led the Republican effort to oppose using statistical sampling to gain a more accurate count of non-white populations that the Census Bureau tended to miss. At the time, Hofeller wrote, quote, "A census that uses sampling and statistical adjustment will be the biggest victory for big government liberalism since the enactment of the Great Society." I want to go to Hofeller speaking in 2001 at the National Conference of State Legislatures.
Elizabeth Kubler-Ross wrote a book on death and dying. Her 5 steps, I believe, can be applied to redistricting. And you can pick the people to whom they apply and the order in which they apply to those people. And those steps are, first is denial. It couldn't happen to me. The next step is bargaining. Maybe I can make a deal. The next step is anger. None of us have ever experienced that in the redistricting process. Next is depression. And finally, acceptance. So you might look at that. Maybe she'll write a new book on redistricting grieving.
That's Thomas Hofeller comparing redistricting to death. Ari Berman.
I mean, it is funny because, I mean, redistricting has led to political deaths. If you think about what they're doing in places like North Carolina, they're trying to maximize Republican advantage. And basically, Hofeller is saying his goal with the census is to draw districts. This is a little technical, Amy, but his goal with the census is to draw districts basically only counting citizens. So for now and for decades, the way districts have been drawn is you count everybody. Everyone is entitled to representation, whether they are a voter or not, a citizen or not. What he's saying is we only want to draw districts counting citizens. What that means is that white Republicans will get a massive over advantage. They'll get a huge boost in representation. And minority areas where there are a lot of immigrants, they will receive less representation. So if the citizenship question is on the census, it will lead to a huge transfer of power to wider and more Republican areas. And Hoffler has stated that explicitly, and that's why the citizenship question was added to the census.
Ari, you write members of Trump's team may not have been fully forthcoming in their testimony under oath. Neither Trump transition team member Mark Newman nor John Gore, the former Assistant Attorney General for Civil Rights, who wrote the Justice Department letter, mentioned Hoffler's involvement in the letter when they were deposed under oath as part of a lawsuit by New York and 17 other states challenging the citizenship question.
Yeah, so the ACLU and other plaintiffs challenging the census citizenship question are trying to sanction these former Trump officials for lying under oath to conceal Tom Hoffler's involvement in this case. There's going to be a hearing in federal court in New York this week, and the big question is, will this make its way to the Supreme Court, and will it matter? I mean, this case is going to be ruled on in a matter of weeks. The justices have likely already written their opinions, so this is all very last minute, and this evidence really undercuts the Trump administration's claims of why they added this question. However, it still remains unclear whether this is going to have any impact on the Supreme Court itself.
So let's talk about gerrymandering and abortion.
So these issues are all connected. And when we saw all of these abortion bans, one thing that I realized is that many of the states passing these abortion bans recently also are very heavily gerrymandered. So you have, for example, in Ohio, which was one state that passed this abortion ban. Republican candidates in Ohio for the state house got 50% of votes in the last election, but control 63% of legislative seats. You look at Missouri, Republican candidates in the Missouri House got 57% of the votes, but control 71% of the seats. So what's happening is that these Republican-controlled states, like Ohio and Missouri, they are more extreme because of gerrymandering. They are more red because of gerrymandering, and that leads to more extreme policies like these abortion bans. And it helps explain why Republican politicians are passing laws that even in their own states people don't want. People don't want blanket bans on abortion, even in places like Missouri and Ohio. But we're seeing these laws passed because Republican politicians are insulating themselves from the will of the voters through gerrymandering.
I mean, this is a really important point. I mean, most Americans are pro-choice, and yet more than half the states have passed abortion restrictions. The state legislatures are anti-choice.
Exactly.
So explain further how gerrymandering leads to this.
So what happens is politicians get elected and they draw districts to maximize their impact and to try to give them as safe of seats as possible. And so they really feel like they are insulated from the will of the voters. They are in very safe districts. And so what's going on here is that they're not really concerned about the views of the public writ large because they feel like they only care about the voters in their districts. They're chiefly worried about a primary challenge. So politics is getting pushed further and further and further to the right. And so public opinion really isn't impacting the discussion of abortion in a lot of these cases. You also have in many of these states overwhelmingly white, overwhelmingly male legislators that are not affected by abortion the same ways. And many of the constituencies that are most harmed by gerrymandering, constituencies like women, younger people, people of color, they are also going to be most affected by these abortion bans.
And talk about Georgia in particular, the state that Stacey Abrams lost, that Brian Kemp won. Brian Kemp, who was the Secretary of State, so he was in charge of his own election when he ran for governor against Abrams, and how that plays out overall in politics, and particularly around abortion.
So voter suppression also explains why we have these extreme gerrymandering, these extreme abortion bans, because you look at Georgia, for example, where Brian Kemp was both Secretary of State and running for governor at the same time in 2018. He was essentially overseeing his own election. In that election, Georgia purged 2 million people from the voting rolls. They closed 214 polling places. 53,000 people had their registrations put on hold weeks before the election. All of this helped Brian Kemp and hurt Stacey Abrams and allowed Brian Kemp to eke out a very narrow victory over Stacey Abrams. And then he signed this abortion ban that Stacey Abrams was strongly opposed to, which was passed by a legislature in Georgia that was heavily gerrymandered in favor of Republicans. So you have an extremely gerrymandered Republican legislature, a governor who was elected in part of voter suppression, signing one of the most extreme abortion laws in the country. Had it not been for gerrymandering, had it not been for voter suppression, you might have had a very different legislature and a different governor in Georgia, and this would have been blocked or not have been passed in the first place.
So Hoffler's hard drives that his estranged daughters have now released. Talk about other effects that you can see coming out of this.
Well, it's really important because the next election is going to determine redistricting for the next decade. And in fact, the next census is going to form the basis for that redistricting in the next decade. And so right now, there's a lawsuit in North Carolina challenging these gerrymandered state maps. The question is, will the court strike down these maps before 2020? So there'll be a new North Carolina legislature. If there's a new North Carolina legislature, there will be a different election in 2020, and that will lead to different outcomes. And so we could be seeing Republican gerrymandering efforts unraveling in North Carolina, one of the most important swing states in the country. But more importantly, I think this just focuses attention on other issues. There's been so much focus on Trump, Amy, and everything that Trump is doing. But really, when it comes to state-level races, the gerrymandering at the local level and the census that forms the basis for redistricting, this has a huge outcome on politics for the next decade. And if Republicans are able to rig the census for the next decade, they will be able to rig so many important aspects of American politics as well.
Finally, what is happening in Florida? This is a separate issue, but the whole issue of reenfranchising what is called returning citizens, people who have served time in prison.
Florida passed a really historic ballot initiative in 2018 to restore voting rights to 1.4 million people with previous felony convictions. It was the largest expansion of voting rights in that state since the Voting Rights Act. Now the Florida legislature has passed a law dramatically scaling that back by saying that you have to pay all fines, fees, and restitution before you're eligible to vote. This is basically akin to a poll tax. People owe thousands, in some cases millions of dollars. There's one woman in Florida that owes $59 million for insurance fraud. And so if this law is signed by the governor of Florida, what it means is that people that thought they were in line to be able to vote, voters who thought they had passed this ballot initiative to reenfranchise people, instead, now you're saying that people have to jump through serious financial hoops, even after they had paid their debt to society, to be able to vote. This could affect hundreds of thousands of people, disenfranchise hundreds of thousands of people in Florida before the 2020 election.
Well, I want to thank you very much, Ari Berman, for joining us, senior writer at Mother Jones, reporting fellow at the Type Media Center, author of Give Us the Ballot, The Modern Struggle for Voting Rights in America. We'll link to your piece in Mother Jones headlined, Architect of GOP Gerrymandering Was Behind Trump's Census Citizenship Question. When we come back, Clarence Thomas knows nothing of my work. Author Adam Cohen says the Supreme Court justice used his book to tie abortion to eugenics and got it wrong. Stay with us.
1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6.
Count 5 or 6 by Cornelius. This is Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, The War and Peace Report. I'm Amy Goodman. As we turn now to the ongoing assault on abortion rights across the country. Last week in Missouri, a judge granted a temporary restraining order to Planned Parenthood Friday, allowing the state's only abortion clinic to remain open despite health department officials refusing to renew its license. The ruling came down just hours before the clinic's license was scheduled to expire. It's just one step in the fight to save Missouri's Planned Parenthood. The next hearing is scheduled for tomorrow. Missouri legislators recently passed an 8-week abortion ban, and the state is one of dozens where abortion rights are under threat. Also last week, Louisiana became the 5th state to ban abortions after 6 weeks, without exceptions for rape or incest. The ban will only go into effect if Mississippi's 6-week abortion ban is upheld. A federal judge temporarily blocked the law last week. Kentucky, Ohio, and Georgia have also recently moved to outlaw abortions after 6 weeks. Alabama's passed a near-total ban on abortions. As these states tighten anti-choice legislation, others are fighting to strengthen access to reproductive rights. The Vermont legislature has approved a new bill that would prohibit the government from interfering with the right to get abortions. A dozen other states have their own legislation in the works to guarantee the right to abortion. Both sides are preparing for a challenge to Roe v. Wade, the landmark 1973 Supreme Court ruling that recognizes the constitutional right to an abortion. All of this comes as the Supreme Court declined last week to take up a provision of an Indiana law that bars abortions based on the sex, race, or disability of the fetus. The decision keeps in place a lower court injunction on the measure. But Justice Clarence Thomas indicated in a 20-page opinion that he supports the law, writing, quote, enshrining a constitutional right to an abortion based solely on the race, sex, or disability of an unborn child, as Planned Parenthood advocates, would constitutionalize the views of the 20th century eugenics movement, unquote. To make his case, Justice Thomas cited a book by Adam Cohen titled Imbeciles, the Supreme Court, American Eugenics, and the Sterilization of Carrie Buck. Justice Thomas's opinion has been widely discredited, including by the author of the very book he cites in his opinion. In an article for The Atlantic headlined, Clarence Thomas Knows Nothing of My Work, Adam Cohen writes, quote, Thomas is absolutely right that we need to remember our eugenics past and make sure that we do not make the same mistakes again. He's absolutely wrong that individual women making independent decisions about their pregnancies are the eugenicists of our time. Adam Cohen joins us here in our New York studio. Adam, welcome back to Democracy Now!
Great to be here, Amy.
So talk about reading Justice Thomas's decision and realizing he's quoting you.
Okay, on one level, you have to be a little flattered, right? The highest court in the land, when they want to write about a subject, cites your book, a dozen or more times. That's nice. But when you read the substance of what Thomas was saying, very concerning, very disturbing, because his history is not right, and there's a real ideological agenda behind how he's using the history.
Explain.
Sure. Okay, so we have not generally in the Supreme Court talked about abortion in eugenics terms. There have been many other ways of discussing whether abortion should be constitutional or not. Clarence Thomas is making a bold foray here and saying, let's start using this eugenic lens. And in fact, let's go back in history to the eugenics movement of the 20th century, which was a very big deal. Not so well known, but in the 1910s and 1920s, more than half of American states adopted eugenic sterilization laws that allowed the state to choose certain kinds of people that they deem feeble-minded or otherwise unfit to reproduce, and to forcibly sterilize them. So that was a very big deal. Clarence Thomas is trying to connect that movement to abortion and say abortion is bad for the same reasons the eugenics movement was wrong. The only problem is the eugenics movement of the 20th century was never about abortion. Abortion was always illegal. The leaders of the eugenics movement said we don't support abortion. They were supporting this other thing, forced sterilization. So his history is wrong, and he's using it to try to come up, I think, with another argument against abortion. The anti-abortion forces have really failed to convince a majority of Americans that abortion is killing a person. So I think they want another argument, and you might even say a more PC argument. Let's not think of it that way. They're saying, let's think of it as being kind of like racism, kind of like eugenics, like a bad thing. But the problem is that's not really what abortion is about.
So explain where Clarence Thomas is coming from. You're also writing a book on the Supreme Court, and did what he say surprise you?
It did, because, as I say, it's not really the way in which the debate has been framed. It's really fresh and new and somewhat radical. And it's also just wrong in thinking about abortion, because when you strip away the history, which you have to do because the history is all wrong, abortion is not an act of eugenics. Eugenics is a very specific thing. It's the government saying, we're not going to let certain people who we deem to be unfit reproduce because we want to lift up the gene pool and make the gene pool of future generations more fit and better. That's not what abortion is about. When a woman in Indiana decides she's pregnant, she takes a test, finds out there's something about the fetus that is going to produce a very sick baby, maybe a baby that'll die in its first year after, terrible pain and a bad life. If she decides not to bring that baby to term and to give birth, that's not a eugenics decision. That's a woman making a personal decision about what she wants to do with her life. The government is not telling her to do that. So he's really twisting everything here.
Do you think he understands the distinction?
I think he does, but, you can see why, from a propaganda purpose, this is good branding, right? If you can say about abortion, hey, abortion doesn't just stop a beating heart, as the movement likes to say. It's also a way of trying to change our gene pool in a way that ordinary people might say, well, that's not really the right thing to do. I think it's a good branding thing. It's just not true.
The Supreme Court did allow to stand the fetal remains portion of the bill, the fetal remains burial portion of the bill.
That's correct. And this ruling was widely held as a compromise. Oh, isn't that nice that there's one part of the Indiana law that's not going to stand and another that is. But it's very strange that we've gotten to a point in the abortion movement that this is considered a compromise, because what the law requires is really that every fetus have a burial, kind of like a baby would have a burial, which, many women may not want that to be done to the fetal remains, and also they may be charged for it by the abortion provider. They might pay $1,000 or more for this thing, so it's hard to see that as a compromise. We're seeing abortion rights really eroding, and this is another example of that.
Have you written to the justice to say he misquoted you?
No, I haven't, but I'm hoping that he reads The Atlantic and that he'll see it there.
So, Adam Cohen, you are writing a book on the Supreme Court. You also focus on precedent-setting cases, and I wanted to ask you about where you think the Supreme Court is headed when it comes to abortion. Last year, Judge Brett Kavanaugh appeared before the Senate Judiciary Committee, and he was asked about Roe v. Wade in his confirmation hearing.
One of the important things to keep in mind about Roe v. Wade is that it has been reaffirmed many times over the past 45 years, as you know. And most prominently, most importantly, reaffirmed in Planned Parenthood versus Casey in 1992.
So that was Brett Kavanaugh before he became Supreme Court Justice. Of course, he was approved. It is officially the Roberts Court. Some call it now the Kavanaugh Court. What does it mean, what he said, and where do you see the Supreme Court going right now? Yeah,
well, first of all, I don't think we can give a lot of credence to what people say at confirmation hearings. They tend to say what they think the Senate wants to hear in order to get themselves confirmed. Chief Justice Roberts himself famously said at his confirmation hearing, I see my role as a judge as being an umpire, just calling balls and strikes, and then, look at the kind of decisions we've been getting in the last few years. So I don't think we can say from that Kavanaugh wouldn't vote to overturn Roe v. Wade. And the thing is that for really a long time, we've had one justice in the middle, a swing justice. It was O'Connor, and then it was Kennedy, who, although conservative, has not been willing to pull the trigger and overturn Roe v. Wade. The question is now, do we have one of those swing justices, or with the recent appointments of Kavanaugh and Gorsuch, do we now have 5 justices who would all actually overturn it? We just don't know the answer.
And what about Roberts, Chief Justice Roberts, where you think he would stand? Many were surprised when Obamacare, when the Affordable Care Act came before the Supreme Court, that he actually voted for it, even though he had expressed criticism of it.
He did, and that made people think maybe he's a potential swing. But that is a very different kind of issue, and that was one where maybe he was trying to act a little bit more like an umpire. But on abortion, it could be different. He's very religious. When he went to Harvard as an undergraduate, he went to Mass every Sunday. His wife has been active in anti-abortion causes. So he may just feel, if this is a real sort of heart issue for him, we just don't know if he's been waiting all these years to overturn Roe v. Wade.
Before you go, I wanted to ask you about Angela Merkel. Angela Merkel, the German chancellor, was at Harvard University this past week giving a major graduation address and took an apparent swipe at President Trump and his policies during her keynote commencement address. Merkel, who received an honorary degree from Harvard, took aim at Trump's protectionism, trade wars, and his efforts to expand the wall along the U.S.-Mexico border.
That's why I want to leave this wish with you. Tear down walls of ignorance and narrow-mindedness, for nothing has to stay as it is.
The German chancellor did not mention Trump by name, but compared his wall-building efforts to the Berlin Wall that restricted her movements as she grew up in East Germany. You were at your Harvard commencement, your Harvard graduation reunion. You were there?
I was there in the audience, yes. And she was very well received. It was a beautiful speech. And she did begin, as you said, by really this personal story of as a young woman growing up on the other side of the Berlin Wall, how every day when she entered the workforce, she would go to the laboratory where she was working, and she could just see the wall. And she knew that on the other side of it was freedom. Every day she saw this personal barrier in her own life. So she used that to, as you say, then launch this other idea that walls in general, the walls we have now, the walls we're thinking about building, are dangerous. And it really was a plea for globalism and mutual understanding across borders. And it was very well received. She was really quite the star of the day.
She didn't mention Trump by name.
No, but there were moments with this and with some other sort of veiled references that people sort of knew she seemed to be talking about Trump, but no, she did not.
Well, Adam Cohen, thank you so much for being with us. Journalist, lawyer, co-editor of the nationalbookreview.com, author of a number of books, most recently Imbeciles, the Supreme Court, American Eugenics, and the Sterilization of Carrie Buck. We'll link to his recent piece for The Atlantic headlined, Clarence Thomas Knows Nothing of My Work. Adam Cohen is writing a book about the last 50 years of the Supreme Court. When we come back, President Trump is considering presidential pardons for American military members convicted of war crimes. Stay with us.
Oh, my mama, she gave me these feathered breaths. Oh, my mama, she told me, use your voice, my little bird. She said, sing, 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 sing melodies. And she sang, 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 sang melodies. Oh, my mama, she did give me fancy feet I'll be dancing on. And I'll tap, tap, tap my toes into those creaking floorboards. Oh, my mama, she took my little hand and held on tight. Oh, the mama.
Oh, My Mama by Alela Diane. This is Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, The War and Peace Report. I'm Amy Goodman. We end today's show looking at President Trump's consideration of presidential pardons for American military members convicted of war crimes. One of the requests for a pardon is reportedly for Navy SEALs Special Operations Chief Edward Gallagher, facing charges of shooting unarmed civilians and killing a wounded captive teenager by stabbing him with a knife, then staging a re-enlistment ceremony over the dead teenager's body. On Thursday, a military judge in San Diego ordered Gallagher freed from custody, citing prosecutorial misconduct in his murder trial for war crimes. The judge ruled prosecutors exceeded their authority when they tried to plant computer code in emails in order to find the source of leaks about the case. On Friday, the judge said prosecutors violated Gallagher's right to a fair trial. The court has yet to rule on whether to remove prosecutors or to throw out the case entirely. One of the attorneys for Gallagher also represents the Trump Organization. One of Gallagher's most vocal supporters in Congress has been Republican Congressmember Duncan Hunter of California. This is Hunter speaking on the podcast Zero Blog 30, an audio release last week, in which he admits to killing hundreds of innocent people while serving in the U.S. military during the Iraq War during his deployment to Fallujah in 2004.
Well, then how do you judge me? So I was an artillery officer, and we fired hundreds of rounds into Fallujah. Right. Killed probably hundreds of civilians, if not scores, if not hundreds of civilians. Probably killed women and children, if there were any left in the city when we invaded. So do I get judged too?
That's California Republican Congressmember Duncan Hunter. This comes as Trump may also be considering a pardon request for Blackwater contractor Nicholas Slatton, who was found guilty twice of first-degree murder in the deadly 2007 Nisour Square massacre in Baghdad, which killed 14 unarmed Iraqi civilians. He was sentenced to life in prison last December. Well, for more, we're joined from Charlottesville, Virginia, by Waitman Wade Bourne, a combat veteran of Iraq and a Holocaust and genocide studies historian. He's a lecturer at the University of Virginia, author of Marching into Darkness, the Wehrmacht and the Holocaust in Belarus. He's a graduate of the United States Military Academy at West Point. Bourne has just written an op-ed piece for the Washington Post, which is headlined, "I led a platoon in Iraq. Trump is wrong to pardon war criminals." In it, he writes, quote, "When Trump champions war criminals as brave patriots who are simply victims of political correctness, he seems to push for a climate that condones unethical and criminal behavior. He appears to write off war crimes as the cost of doing business. If this is the example our military is given, we should not be surprised to see more Gallaghers." Waitman Wade Bourne, welcome to Democracy Now!
Thanks for having me. Appreciate it.
So talk about the people who President Trump is talking about pardoning. Let's begin with Edward Gallagher and your concerns about the President of the United States pardoning him.
Yeah, I mean, I think there's a lot of issues with Gallagher. And I first want to just start by mentioning one thing about what you mentioned at the beginning of the show regarding his the judgment by the judge that for prosecutorial misconduct. What we're really talking about here is an amazing job by the defense team, but it's read receipts on emails. That's what his defense team has spun into planting code. It's a read receipt to let the prosecution team know that somebody has read an email. So, you know, that's a really flimsy excuse for letting him out. But to get back to your original question, you know, the president has chosen really the worst possible options of anyone to pardon, and Gallagher probably being one of the most egregious. Among the things that he is accused of are shooting a child, shooting an old man, murdering a 15-year-old non-combatant who was a combatant, but then as a wounded prisoner of war is now a non-combatant, with a knife, stabbing him to death, texting his friends about this stabbing, holding a reenlistment ceremony over the body of this individual. Any one of these things is an egregious breach of the law of armed conflict and the law of war, and just a complete moral and ethical failure. And I really don't see any reason why any pardon is justified. And I should conclude those initial statements with the fact that this has not even gone to trial yet. So in a sense, what we have is the president not only appearing to condone such activities or oppose prosecution based on his concept of patriotism, et cetera, but also demonstrating a clear lack of confidence in our military justice system, not even letting them have the opportunity to do their job, which is to investigate and prosecute people accused of war crimes. So it's disturbing on many, many levels, at least to me and a lot of other folks.
Let's go back to one of Eddie Gallagher's most vocal supporters in Congress, Republican Congressmember Duncan Hunter of California, speaking on the podcast Zero Blog 30. He was asked specifically about Gallagher allegedly stabbing to death this teenager, a teenage ISIS fighter who was brought in for medical treatment. He was a POW, as you pointed out. Let's go to Duncan Hunter's response.
I frankly don't care if he was killed. I just don't care, and that's my personal point of view. And as a congressman, that's my prerogative to help a guy out like that. Even if everything that the prosecutors say is true in this case, then Eddie Gallagher should still be given a break, I think.
In February, Congressman Hunter spoke about Gallagher's prosecution during an interview on KUSI in San Diego.
You have lawyers that don't know what the word combat means prosecuting guys for killing the enemy. So even if everything that the prosecution said is true, so let's say that Chief Gallagher killed a verified, designated ISIS combatant, my answer is, so what? That's his job, to close with and destroy the enemy through fire and close combat. That's what our military does. We would not have won World War I. We would not have won World War II if we would have fought the way that we have to fight now.
So that is the California Congressman, Duncan Hunter, who, by the way, is headed for trial himself, not for what he says he did in Iraq, killing hundreds of civilians, but for corruption. He and his wife have been charged. Wade Bourne, you're a combat veteran of Iraq. Can you respond to what he said and he thinking that this is a defense for not only himself, but for Edward Gallagher?
Yeah, I mean, it's incredibly shocking to hear him say something like that. It crosses a lot of boundaries for me, not least of which is just the complete lack of empathy that one shows when he says, I don't care whether this person was killed, even if the prosecution is correct, which means that it was a cold-blooded murder by knife. He still doesn't care. That to me is galling. It's offensive. He's flat out wrong about how historically wrong about how we fought World War I, World War II. We did not conduct ourselves in the manner in which he claims. He clearly doesn't know what he's talking about there. And also this idea that he seems to be portraying first when he admitted that he took selfies with a dead body, and this idea that, well, we all did that in Iraq. No, we did not all do that in Iraq. The overwhelming majority of us did not do that and recognize that as criminal and wrong. And this idea of just, once we enter into a war, our job is to go kill anything that moves to win the war it's blatantly false. And it demonstrates a real disturbing lack of understanding of how to deal with civilians and non-combatants on the battlefield from someone who was in a position of authority leading our soldiers, in this case Marines, overseas. It's just it's deplorable.
What's very interesting is that it was his fellow SEALs that turned him in. And can you talk about this and who took them seriously and who ignored them?
Yeah, so in the case of Gallagher, it certainly was his own SEALs who turned him in, to the extent that, according to some of them, while they were in country, they manipulated his weapon so that it wouldn't be as accurate, because they were just concerned that he continued to shoot at non-combatants. Gallagher's defense team argues that these are disgruntled individuals who didn't like Gallagher personally, didn't think he should be promoted, didn't think he should get an award. And what we're overlooking here is that these are some of our best trained, most committed, most dedicated special operators. They are not the kind of people who have their feathers ruffled easily. And so if they are disturbed about what someone is doing to the extent that they are willing to repeatedly risk their careers, as they're being told directly by both Gallagher and others to drop this and let it go, and they do not. I mean, in my view, they're heroes for what they're doing at the risk of their careers. I think we need to take that very seriously. And by the way, I should note that bringing up these charges because you think that Gallagher is incompetent, should not be training SEALs, should not be promoted, should not get an award, is not incompatible with the justification being that he has committed these war crimes that you have witnessed when you've been deployed with him.
Waitman Wadeborn, you wrote in your Washington Post piece, in my book, Marching into Darkness, I wrote about the German army's participation in the Holocaust at the small unit level. One conclusion was that even given the premeditated, racist, and highly ideologized environment of the Wehrmacht, the culture of each unit and the institutional leadership most directly influenced whether war crimes were committed. Murderous leaders led murderous units. Explain that further, and then talk about President Trump talking about Edward Gallagher as a war hero.
Absolutely. And I mean, as I pointed out in the article and as you read there, obviously I'm not comparing our military or claiming that our military were Nazis, are Nazis. There's many, many things that are different. However, there are certain truisms, I think, in all military units, probably from the Romans, in terms of individual dynamics within units and how people interact, how leaders interact. And the point that I'm making there is that leaders set the standards for behavior. Subordinates, soldiers, sailors, airmen, Marines, they know what the boss cares about. They know what his or her pet peeves happen to be. They know what his or her values happen to be, and they will usually adhere to those. And when, as is hopefully mostly the case, those are positive values, positive morals, then they will act accordingly. However, when we have guidance from either the presidential level all the way down to the platoon leader level that is counter to our morals or is dysfunctional, then they will often be encouraged to do the same thing. We said in the Army that leaders make policy by everything that they do and everything that they allow to happen or fail to correct. So moving it a little further to what the president appears to be doing, by minimizing, by underwriting the crimes of people like Gallagher, people like Behenna, people like Hunter, in this case as well, he is sending a message that these kinds of behaviors are acceptable. As you mentioned earlier in the show, that war is hell. Some eggs are going to get broken. Civilians are going to get killed. Not a big deal. This is how we fight war, which is absolutely antithetical to how we do things. And
then you have Nick Slatton, who was convicted twice of first-degree murder for the Nisour Square massacre. President Trump talking about pardoning him. He worked for Blackwater.
Yeah, I mean, and I'm not as familiar with the details of that case, except to say that, again, we have a system to prosecute individuals who commit war crimes. And particularly in this case, given that we have a more complicated situation with a civilian working for the military but not under Uniform Code of Military Justice, the fact that that conviction has gone through the process that we have set up twice and has been upheld, there doesn't seem to be any compelling reason for a pardon. Usually a pardon, if done in the best of intentions, is to correct a wrong, whether it's a racist conviction or something to that effect. And in this case, there isn't a wrong to be corrected.
Wait a minute. I wanted to ask you one question very quickly before we get to the end, and that is the Virginia Beach mass shooter. This is pretty much a different issue. Dwayne Craddock was enlisted in the Virginia National Guard for years. Other mass shooters with a military or law enforcement background included David Long, Marine, Afghanistan war vet Nicholas Cruz, high school Army ROTC, and a number of others who were involved with mass shootings. This relationship between serving in the military and mass killings, your thoughts?
Well, I think it's frankly disingenuous to really associate those. You know, a lot of times the news will say something to the effect of...
I hate to end it here, but we're going to have to. I want to thank you for being with us.